So in the last tutorial, I started talking about the Reformation. I'm going to talk more about it. But in this 5-minute little snip, I want to talk about another historical transformational force that does the same thing. That is, this is another historical shift that helps form that modern sense of I that's going to be so important to the chorus and it's so important to Shakespeare. And that shift is an economic one, social and economic one, whereas the Reformation, of course, is more of a religious or social psychological one. But the shift I want to talk about here for about 4 or 5 minutes is the shift from feudalism to capitalism. The medieval world was organized by feudal society. And what that meant is, for the most part, particularly in England, but also in Europe, society organized itself around large feudal estates, Feudal. You can look this up. And these feudal estates were owned by one family, one lord. And they were self-sufficient. That is, within the feudal estate, everyone had a role. Everyone played a part, from the landowner to the farmer to the tenant owners, the people that sort of worked the land a little bit, to the servants. And that economic system differs from capitalism, the system we lived in, and that generally it wasn't terribly interested in growing. It wasn't interested in accumulating capital. It stayed the same. Feudal lords liked to protect their feudal estate, of course, but they weren't interested in gathering up more lands in the way a sort of a corporation would be today. Corporations, capital, generally, by definition, wants more capital. That's all it does. But feudal society existed as a collective. Doesn't mean it was equal. Again, it was strictly hierarchical. There was the landowner and then everyone else, from the eldest son all the way down to the lowliest tenant. But it was very different from the capitalist structure. So, in other words, if you were born onto a feudal estate, you didn't say, hey, how can I improve my situation? How can I move up in the world? You did what your parents did within that collective structure. Upward mobility really wasn't a thought. There's something akin to the old St. Augustine, the great North African monk, had a religious dictum that said, hands off yourself. And what he meant by that was different from maybe what your grandmother might have meant by it. But hands off yourself for St. Augustine meant accept your place in the world. God has put you where he wants you. Stay there. And again, it's very different from our sort of sense of things. And we live in a capitalist, upward mobile society. All of you are taking classes, presumably, because you want to get a degree, you want to learn, you want to change your station in life in some way and improve it. That was foreign to the medieval world. But that feudal system starts to break down during Shakespeare's lifetime. It really starts to break down around the 13th century, and it's really crumbling by the time we get to the 16th century when Shakespeare is born, and crumbles completely in the 17th or 18th century. And that requires, when that social economic strata changes, it requires a new kind of sense of self, like what we talked about with the Reformation. In order to flourish in a capitalist society, you can't think of yourself as part of a collective. You're going to stand still. You have to think about yourself as an individual actor, an individual agent, someone who's going to take care of himself or herself and move up in the world. So that social economic shift does exactly the same thing as the religious shift of the Reformation, in that it pushes or creates a sense of individuality, a sense of the I, a sense of the self, which is fundamentally different from the sense of the self that had been there before. Okay? And so we'll talk a bit throughout the course when we look at Shakespeare's plays about that shift from feudalism to capitalism, because it's a shift like the shift of the Reformation, which brings about a sense of the individual I.